see
Very
you.
good. How are you?
How are you doing? I'm very well, thank you. Are you in London today? Brilliant. Now, I can see we've already got quite a few people joining us. Today we're joined by Carole Collet. Carole Collet is a pioneer in biomaterials, biodesign, and an absolute guru on the subject. You have various titles at Central St Martin's, and you have a very impressive folio of projects and exhibitions and publications and all sorts. Tell our audience a little bit more about your background, Carole, how you got involved with biomaterials and biodesign and your work.
Yeah, first of all, thank you so much for inviting me. Thanks for this introduction. So I come from a textile design background, actually. That was my first degree, my BA studies, and I did my MA at Central St Martin's as well. And I've always been interested in looking into how I could reconcile my ecological interest and my creative textile design interest. And it's in that sort of quest and inquiry that I came across the concept of biomimicry quite a long time ago now. First reading Janine Benyus on biomimicry. And for me, that was really, after looking at, upcycling, recycling, decreasing or changing the types of dyes, I felt that looking at what we can learn from the natural world was really where I would find the answers. And that was about 20 years ago now, and I have non-stop been looking at biology since then as a means to look for alternatives, look for other ways of actually constructing textiles, making textiles, patterning textiles. So for me, what my inspiration is very much in the natural world and in live active biology and learning how biological systems have evolved, how they can respond, react, and how I can work with living systems to develop new, particularly textile embellishments or materials.
Wonderful. And I think one of the things that stands out about your folio, I mean, although you're what I call a folio professional, in that although obviously you have a number of responsibilities at Central St Martin's, you effectively have a wide-ranging skill set. So you're able to do the hands-on design, you are an accomplished researcher, but you also lead, direct, conceive projects, an educator. So you've really, got this spectrum of activities that you coordinate across the board. At what point did you bring in the educational element? At what point did you start to sort of think effectively about scaling up the activity by handing on your expertise and building out the community of those in this field?
Well, researcher, you always do what we call a sort of contextual study. You look at who else is working in that field, who else is doing what, so we can learn from each other. But also the idea of research is to advance knowledge, the creation of new knowledge. And so to advance new knowledge, you actually have to know what is the existing de facto knowledge. And so therefore that entails you straight away want to know what your community is. And when I first fell in really active biology after conversation, this was a project a long time ago with the Medical Research Council, where I was partnered with a Nobel laureate, Sir John Sulston. And in these conversations, he talked to me about synthetic biology, which was this upcoming new field. And that was back in 2007. That was even before the first synthetic cell was created in 2010 by Craig Venter. So I started looking into this and started to think, okay, well, what does this mean for design? What can this science bring? And looking at who else is working in that space. And there were not that many people. And I actually decided to curate an exhibition, which was staged at the EDF Foundation in Paris. It was called Alive, New Design Frontier, as a means to look at who is doing what in that field where we start to combine biology and design together. But what I was interested in is not just playing with biology or with living system for the sake of it. I was interested in looking at how that could bring up new answers in terms of ecology. So for me, my take in biodesign and my research in that field has always been driven by a real mission to look for alternative ecological approaches to how we make textiles, how we practice textiles. And with that, the curation of that exhibition led me to develop a real framework from people who were, bio-informed, bio-inspired, to what I call the bio-artisan, actually collaborating craft systems, to those working in more speculative field. And I felt it was very interesting to start framing the who's who in that space. And then very quickly you get to know everybody. and that's, as this is, through some of these networks we've also met. So I think it's important when you are focusing your research in particular field, like biodesign in this case, it's important to know the who's who, to value each other, to support each other, and to create that sort of network. And so, of course, that, working at Central St. Martin's in a world-leading academic institution, I also felt that it was important that that practice of biodesign became framed by an academic, rigorous, critical system. And I felt that there were a lot of people working with biology, just, to play with it. And for me, I just felt like, well, this could turn into a gadget kind of context. And I felt it was important that we really kind of looked at, the critical framework for this practice. And that's how we decided to set up the new Masters of Biodesign, which is now led by Nancy Dinish at Central St. Martin's, because I felt it was important to actually, write a curriculum. And you mentioned that, I do many things, and it's true, but that's partly because I have a curious mind, but partly because there is so much to do to address our planetary emergency. We need to do it through research. We need to do it through education. We need to really look at training the next generation of designers with this biological understanding, so we can start to care for the planet as opposed to simply use it as a resource. So I do a lot of activities. I work with industry as well. We have a wonderful partnership with LVMH, and that's because we need to be on all those fronts to really win that battle. And I think for me, that's why I'm involved in, I've got my fingers in so many cells, in so many pots.
And that, that in my experience, I think although our field is niche, I think it's fair to say there are quite a few people that have got quite a diverse folio. And it brings about that sort of 360 perspective, because as you say, there is so much to do. But when you are working in academia with industry, when you're also involved in communications and research, you can see those knowledge gaps. What of the sort of, we've come a long way in 20 years. What would you say are the biggest changes that you've noticed since you started this journey? What are the big shifts that have happened in this last 2 decades?
It's taken seriously now. And I think it's inspiring a new type, particularly in terms of textiles and fashion, a new type of fashion. But even if you look at 15 years ago, there were just a few of us, as you know. And I remember going to scientific conferences discussing synthetic biology, ethics, biotech, being the only designer there. And then scientists tell me, what are you doing here? And I used to say, well, actually, what you're doing will change the textile sector. And I think at the time they were looking at how, particularly with synthetic biology, how that could really improve healthcare, medicine, as well as energy. There was a lot of research in synthetic biology for biofuel production. And I said, no, it's in textiles. And of course, textiles doesn't have that sort of big aura, when you're in science. And it's often thought more sort of an aesthetic driven field, but actually it's, was at the core of the Industrial Revolution, and it's now at the core of the bio-revolution. And I think for me, that's the big difference, is that now it's understood. A lot of scientists are really taking textiles seriously. I have many great conversations with scientists as a textile designer. And so I think for me, there's an understanding that we also need to converge scientific research and biodesign research because it's one thing to look for a new molecule or a new enzyme or new system, but you also need to do that in relation to its potential design application. And that's what designers do best. So I think the big change for me is that it's now taken seriously. There's a lot of, it's gone out of the lab. There's a whole landscape of new startups really pushing this. And I think that's, for me, very exciting to see. My main concern could be that we still need to make sure that we don't go back to where we come from in simply using biology or still, you know, the natural world as a resource, but we need to use biodesign as a means to develop alternative solutions to move away from our petrol economy, but also in a way that we need to start looking at how we can care for the natural world. And so how can we go beyond simply, you know, tuning what we do with biology into a mode where we can actually help restore what we do because of our new biological tools.
Yep. And I think, you know, I agree with you on biomaterials, because effectively what this requires is going right back to the building blocks. And what I find incredibly exciting about biomaterials is the fact that when you change those building blocks, you realize it's not just the design that is being changed, it's the entire system. It's the production, it's the retail, it's the distribution, it's the whole concept of what you're selling. Obviously, historically in fashion, people used to buy things with a view to them lasting a relatively long time. Then we got into the realms of fashion being fast fashion. And now we've got something else, because with biomaterials, obviously, ultimately, they are that which will biodegrade at different time scales. And so there's thinking about this whole circularity of the garments, of apparel, and of everything that you're making with biomaterials, and trying to work out, well, you know, what are the lifespans, and what is this cycle? Where are things coming from? Where are they going? What's every single step in between? So it's a much more involved and a much more I think interesting proposition than design of old, than textiles of old, because it is so very dynamic. At Central St Martin's, you have so many different research projects going on, and in your career, obviously, you've got to see so many different facets of how this is developing in biomaterials. What for you are the most exciting developments that you've seen? What really kind of blows your mind in terms of the potential of biomaterials for apparel and beyond?
What is beginning to excite me, it might sound a little bit technical and might not be as exciting for our audience, but one of the key issues in textiles and fashion is the recyclability of mixed fibers. So particularly with fast fashion, quite often you see polycotton, polyester cotton. So anytime you have mixed fibers, it's harder to recycle, because normally, you know, cotton can be recycled into cotton, polyester into polyester, but when you have a mixed fabric, it's much harder. And there's a lot of research now in either starting from waste polyester, turning back into new polyester through biological tools, but also there's some new startups emerging, really looking at how we can use these mixed fibers. And this is where the bulk of the waste is when it comes to fast fashion. So a bit technical, not terribly sexy in terms of how it looks, but I think the notion that we are moving into a phase where we'll be able to recycle with quite a high level of efficiency these mixed fibers will make a radical change, particularly in relation to fast fashion waste.
I'd agree with that. I mean, it strikes me with the general sort of issue of plastics pollution. One of the biggest problems is tire wear. I co-authored a report on that a couple of years ago. And the big problem there is that tires are made of these recipes of lots of different chemical compounds. There's lots going on in there. And so they're an absolute recycling nightmare. And at the moment, the major tire manufacturers, they didn't acknowledge the scale of the problem of tire wear pollution in the first instance. Now there's no denying it, because now thankfully the data is coming through to say, well, the runoff from the tire wear is making fish species infertile in places like the surroundings of Seattle, when the extreme pollution coming off the roads reaches a certain point. It has carcinogenic impacts, and these are, you know, problems that are not just related to fish or to sort of marine or freshwater species, but these are evidenced across other animals as well. And so they're now in a situation that they've got to acknowledge it, but you know, they've got these, as I said, these really mixed compounds. They also tend to be very secretive. They treat their sort of tire recipes almost like KFC treats its chicken recipe, because that's their sort of USP, that it's the performance that that recipe gives. And so if they're going to address that problem, you think, well, actually they've got to re-engineer the whole system, because you know, if you can't actually physically make and engineer a tire that is going to perform at the level that's needed for safety, without sort of revealing that compound, then you've actually got to sort of literally redesign the wheel and redesign the sort of safety features of the wheel. So it strikes me as that it's not, as you say, something on the surface of it looks a sexy problem, but actually when you look at the sheer impacts of the way, the sheer volume, and you think about the fact, the urgency, because obviously with the micro and nano pollution from garments, that every spin cycle, unless your washing machine's got a filter, are going down into the sewers, going down potentially out into the oceans. It's cumulative, isn't it? So this is a mind-bogglingly massive problem. And I know they found microplastic pollutions on every strata of the earth, bottom of the deepest ocean trenches, highest mountain tops, air, land, sea. It's everywhere. So it's, in some ways, I mean, it's sexy, and that this is a tough challenge, isn't it? This is a really technical, gritty challenge.
It kind of is, but in a way, I mean, if you look back at, you know, in the early 20th century, where it was really sort of prolific research into turning oil into a whole range of chemicals, into a whole range of, you know, fibers, polyester, and that, you know, drove a huge amount of innovation and you know, new research, new materials. And in a way, we're doing that again now, but trying to get away from that petrol chemical research, and now we're moving into what are the green chemistry tools we can adopt. So we're sort of trying to, you know, I can see a lot of scientists researching that too, reinvent what we've done with petrol, but doing it now with biology. And you know, if you look back at the 20th century, it took, you know, several decades to really reach sort of, you know, very refined, you know, range of quite toxic and nasty chemicals, but the research took a long time. So it's not going to happen overnight. But I think what is very promising for me is to see that, you know, this is really, we are really moving towards that bioeconomy, really looking into how biology can now become the basic starting point. However, and I have to say I'm always careful with this, because I always say, you know, what is natural is not necessarily ecological when you see how humans cultivate the natural. So if you think of cotton, for instance, it's natural, but actually conventional cotton is one of the most toxic fiber. And the same is happening with bio, because it's called bio-based or biomaterial or whatever. It doesn't it's ecological. If these principles of care and ecology are not built in the development of these new bio-based materials, then it won't be. And so I think we need to be very careful again with our language and be very transparent. And some of these biomaterials have, you know, used the term bio or reference biology, but they also are quite upfront saying, but we still use, you know, some sort of petrol-based membranes to waterproof, for instance, because we haven't got yet the green chemistry equivalent. And I think we need to really look for that transparency. So, you know, because it's called bio-based or bio something doesn't mean it's 100% bio-based. So we need to be very careful we don't fall in that trap of that sort of myth that because it's bio, it's ecological. It actually is not necessarily. So I think we need to be very careful with that. And that starts from us, from designers and researchers, being very clear and very transparent about where is it biodegradable, biocompostable, is it heated compost, is it, does it contain, you know, even if it's 2% of a petrochemical, that needs to be clear. And I think that whole research will only be truthful and ethical if we are actually acknowledging that transition doesn't happen overnight. And to replace all these chemicals now need to be done with biology, but we need to learn, and it's one step at a time. It's not easy.
Mm. And where do you feel, I mean, obviously LVMH got behind the project that you direct very early on. I know they support a number of other projects, exhibitions, touring, biodesign, seminal works and so forth. We saw Stella McCartney introduced the biomaterial sequins in her latest collection with a lot of PR around it. How quickly do you see, when you think to the fashion industry, when you look particularly to the big luxury brands, that obviously they like to be on the edge, they like to be seen to be, you know, where it's going, not where it's gone. How quickly do you see them sort of reaching this point where it's no longer a rarity that biomaterials or biodesign is a sort of, you know, popping up, but that this is something that is very much mainstreaming in that sector?
Well, I think this is actually the tricky part, because as much as there are many new materials, and it's quite hard to keep up nearly, you know, on every front, whether they're, you know, from algae, from mycelium, from bacteria, from microbe, from enzyme. It's very exciting, but a lot of these companies are still very young. Some are at proof of concept stage, some are beginning to manufacture. So if you look at Ball Thread, they've set up a manufacturing in Holland. But upscaling these new materials or new processes is very, very costly. And we need a lot more investment in these new companies for them to be able to offer concrete, realistic quantities that will then really change the fashion industry. The fashion industry, you know, is global. It operates at scale. And if you only have 1 square meter of this new material, it's not going to help anybody or anything. So we need more investment. Traditionally, the fashion sector has not invested in R&D. This is something you see in the automotive sector, in the electronic sector, not so much from the fashion sector. But also, if you look at fashion, I mean, we've used, you know, linen. I think that I read recently that the first traces of linen yarns are about 35,000 years old. So we have millennia, you know, worth of history of our use of natural fibers, the cotton and the linen and the hemp. And, you know, polyester, you know, acrylics, and all the polyamides, you know, just very recent, but still we got used to a lot of fibers that, you know, were not particularly new. And suddenly, you know, it's just new fiber everywhere and new types of fibers. It's actually for brands, it can be quite confusing. It's, oh my God, but, you know, there's an algae fiber here, but the quantities are not there. But also the tests, really, the durability isn't there. So, you know, if you look at, you know, a very premium cotton fiber, you know, you can wash that dress or that shirt for years after years, it will last. Some of these new materials, we haven't really tested them. They haven't existed long enough to know, will they be in the same quality in 10 years' time? And so for luxury brands, durability is important. For fast fashion, not so much. So I think it's also a question of pitching the right material for the right market. But I think for me, the next 10 years will be really critical, and hopefully we'll see within the next 10 years an uptake in terms of materials, because we've been able to scale them up. But we won't be able to scale them up if there's no more, we need more both public and private investment in helping developing that bioeconomy. And the research is very active. There's a lot of funding, there's a lot of work going on, but the scaling it up is the issue. And I think that's where we need more work.
Absolutely. Now, I just need to quickly open my window, because although he's got a cat flap, for some reason, my cat likes to come in, come in at the window.
A very
you're interrupting a
fussy
podcast.
Biological system.
He is. I'm his servant, naturally, because he's a cat. And And now I'm just going to have to open the door for him because he won't open the door.
This is what happens in live streams.
He might have to stay in here. So if you hear him meowing, that's him. Yeah, I absolutely agree on the scaling of this. I've noticed that, you know, we have now got some very serious level of interest from the corporations, from the large sort of groups. And it's interesting because certainly in Britain, the research, the National Research sort of Institute and the catalysts, I know, the government catalysts are very much interested in what is happening with biomaterials and the bioeconomy. And also, I know that this is something that has been discussed at parliamentary level with a view to try and getting more research funding in, trying to scale up the activity. And it strikes me very much at the moment, I mean, although this is a global field of development, when I look to most of the sort of the figures that are really leading this, they're mainly either in Europe or they're in the Americas. We've got a few sort of dotted around, but it very much strikes me that Asia, because of Asia's very strong science and technology drive more generally, and because of their resources, Asia could very well grow its capacity in this space. What are your sort of thoughts on that? Do you see Asia becoming a major power player in this space or not?
And I think that's they, you know, they're one of the pioneer leading biotech company. I think it's really to do where it's easier or not to create this sort of research, but in academia and at research level, that's happening in every continent. You know, from South America to Asia to Australia, and I think that's really exciting. Yeah. When it comes to, because the textile industry is now, in terms of the classic manufacturing, is really in Asia. I think there's also, you know, if you look at the Spiber factory in Asia, it's mostly automated. So I think there's a whole issue around, you know, how we can actually start this whole new way of manufacturing using microbes. You know, so it's fermentation. So it's, you know, it's like a biofactory, but it's, you know, making material. So I think there's a big shift happening in terms of automation around potentially these new materials, which might make it more of an investment to start with. So I think it's different kind of factories, frankly. And so I think, but, you know, there's not many yet. You know, that's one of the issue. But, you know, I think the next 10 years, if you look back at the past 10 years, even just thinking of mycelium, it's one of the things I show in some of my lectures. What was in mycelium material 10 years ago, and look at where we are today. I mean, it's literally, you can't even compare. It's incredible, the performance, the quality, the refinement. And so if you think now the next 10 years for everything else that's going on now, I think, you know, I can't wait to see where we will be. So I think, yeah, what matters, I think, is also to make sure that we remain creative with these new materials. And how does that change the way we design with them is really interesting. Because, you know, working with the system, so, you know, as a design researcher, when I work with mycelium, you learn to look after it, but you need to shape it as it grows. It's a very different form of practice compared to take a piece of cloth and cut it or print it. So we also need to make sure there's more people understanding what it means to work with living materials and their creative potential. Because for me, that's the other thing. So yes, that's offering potentially new ecological materials, but it can open up a whole new range of creative practice, a new way to shape, embellish, and finish our cloth. Because I think the creative dimension of biomaterials is sometimes overlooked.
I in the last session I spoke with Susanna Radneva, who is based in Marseille, but she's actually from a traditional indigenous Siberian tribe, and we were talking about her ideas. She works with biomaterials, and she had some fantastic ideas. For example, she'd been looking at an issue I hadn't considered before. She raised the fact that sometimes the biomaterials smell a bit odd they smell a bit organic, a little bit sort of, I guess they might smell rather rural to those that are sort of encountering some of the smells for the first time. And she was talking about how she considers that in her work, and because she's very near to grass,
Perfume, yeah.
we were saying, well, maybe she should collaborate with perfumers, because that would be really interesting. And that made me think that's a whole new dimension to apparel, because normally we think of perfume and clothing as a separate thing, but when you are working with these living organisms and you're engineering these new properties and systems, then you can totally sort of rip up the kind of the canvas, can't you, and just say, right, well, where do we go from here?
Yeah, I think the other dimension as well is there's, for me, I think ethically we need also to be clear, because talking about smell made me think, okay, we could bioengineer, bacterial cellulose to also smell, like a rose. But when we work with biomaterials, we can work with wild natural types, whether they're mycelium or bacteria, but we can also bioengineer them. So that's genetic manipulation. And we can get a microbe or an algae or something else to actually be tailored to produce something. And quite often, in various conferences I speak to, there's sometimes a reluctance to engage with that form of biotech. And for me, I've been standing on the cusp, for a long time, but I think it might be pertinent to using this. For me, when it comes to textiles, if we could bypass the need to color a material after it's been made or grown or harvested, but if you can start to combine different stages, that has a practical advantage. So if you could grow a material which has a beautiful smell, but it's the pink you want or the orange you want at the same time. Currently, these processes happen, in different steps in manufacture, and every new step is more energy, more water, more chemicals. And so if we could find a way to combine many steps simply because we're engineering some of this, that could also be something to consider in terms of ecological benefits of synthetic biology.
And that strikes me, that's really connecting, because when I think to, for example, Neri Oxman's work on engineering materials for architecture and for furniture, she has worked with, among other principles, the idea of bones and the fact that obviously they're a ubiquitous material chemically in the sort of biochemistry of a bone, but their strength, they sort of simultaneously can be very lightweight while also very strong, because the densities are variable throughout the structure. So you've got an incredibly sophisticated form in effective engineering, and that architecturally is really exciting, because of course what you can do is you can think about building a structure out of just one sort of fabric, if you like, rather than these layers of different fabric. And what you're speaking to here, it feels like the same thing. It feels like effectively, these are different properties of life. Obviously, the sort of virtue of the living creatures and their various components is that they're multitasking, aren't they? They do all sorts of amazing different things. And so we're starting to look at design now through this process of integrating these different, what in nature we'd call functional traits. They historically would be broken out. How do we emulate life and bring it all together?
But also, and I'm afraid I'm going to be a bit pessimistic as well, is how do we survive? Because if you look at the scientific data, it was actually in the news today, we will breach the 1.5 degrees Celsius increase in the next 3 years. That's quite scary, because the implication of our climate shift is that we would have more extreme droughts, more extreme flood. If you look at what's happening in parts of Africa right now, no rains for the past 4 years. Wildlife is dying because there's nothing to eat. And I think what will happen if we carry on that track, and we are on the wrong track, we are not cutting down our CO2 emissions enough. We are, according to the IPCC, we're on a track of 3.2 degrees increase. That will start to radically challenge what we can grow for food. There's already challenges around, cotton crops failing because it's too dry or too hot, or I was in France last year, there was no more mustard, which was a big deal for the French, because the Canadian mustard crops had failed the year before. So we have more and more crop failures to do with the climate for food. Of course, we have to feed ourselves, but there will be a point where, if we carry on that track, we also use land to grow, our flax, our hemp, our cotton, for wool, because of course the sheep will be feeding around. But what if we have a much reduced area of land where we can grow textiles because we need more and better for food, because we need to survive? And I think for me, what's interesting is we need to really look at how these new biotech fibers, whether they're syn-bio based or not, could lead to much more the sort of fermentation textile industry, where we can actually brew fibers as opposed to use land and need land. Because frankly, that's what I mean when I talk about survival. We may have to really completely shift the industry to a brewing system as opposed to a harvesting based system when it comes to natural textiles, because we may not have a choice. We may need to actually do that. And I think a lot of we talk about the climate emergency, but now everybody talks about it. So it doesn't feel like there's a fire, in the kitchen, but there is a fire in the kitchen, but everybody's still sitting at a table and eating. And I feel like we really need to have this more strategic interests in these quite radical alternative ways of rethinking how we can grow and make textiles. And I think this is where, for me, synthetic biology comes in. They give us the plan B. When plan A fails, we will have plan B. And yes, you can be critical of, fashion. We need to dress so much. Well, actually, we don't walk around naked. We know even if we reduced our consumption, we still need, we have 8 billion people living on the planet, and we still need to clothe ourselves. So, saying that we don't need as much, yes, but we still need some. And so I think for me, the interest is really looking at a bigger picture, not just at what brand can do in the next 2, 10, 5 years, but really looking at how we may have to consider radical shift because of our climate shift and our biodiversity collapse, because most forms of farming where we grow textiles now, again, whether it's cotton or whether it's, cashmere, whether it's wool, entail the depletion of our lands, our soils. And so, we need to either move fully into regenerative textiles, regenerative agricultural models, which are pro-biodiversity, draw down carbon. But if we can't do that, then it may well be that we need to leave more space for wildlife to recover. The last COP15 in December this year made it clear we now have an agreement to restore 30% of nature by 2030. We have 7 years to restore nature. We have 7 years to halve our carbon footprint. Very, very tight deadlines. And I think if you look at the landscape of new biomaterials, it's very exciting, but it will not resolve the issues in the next 7 years because we're not able to scale up enough. But if we had better and bigger funding, look at what happened with the COVID vaccine. Massive injection of funding, we got it done in very, very few months. We're not seeing that same injection of funding, even though we are on the verge of a catastrophic kind of system failure when it comes to the way we grow food or textiles. And I think we really need to make people understand that, yes, bioresearch will be brilliant and it will help, but it will not be enough, not in the 7 years we have left. And so it's great, but actually it's important to continue that research because they might be able to give us the plan B when our crops fail.
Absolutely. And I think many people find it very hard to join up the dots. If you look at, for example, the biodiversity crisis, we know that it is going to become highly difficult for some of Africa's megafauna to survive in their current locations. We also know that actually some of these species, although people don't classically think of elephants as populating Europe or the big cats or rhino, actually they did.
Yes.
Not so long ago. We did have the megafauna in Europe. Obviously, they're very closely related. And we know that, for example, for the African forest elephant, the forests of Europe are going to be one of the best options for its survival. We know they could survive here if they had the space, because the environment is right, even within the sort of climate trajectories, best and worst case for the next few decades. But we also, as you say, we've got the competing factors. We've got growing the food, we've got creating spaces for nature, we've got urbanization. And I think a lot of people don't realize the sheer scale of the water problem. They don't understand the day zero concept. The fact there are going to come days when you go to your tap and nothing comes out of it, and not just over in Cape Town or in, you know, one of the Brazilian cities, in London and elsewhere. And from that point of view, I mean, it strikes me that the fermentation processed materials and so forth, where you've got less use of water, are a much more viable proposition than something that, like, let's say, cotton is incredibly water intensive,
but not
and
just
land
that, the
intensive.
coloring and all the finishing of textiles. And I think if you look at what happens, I was talking to someone who manufactures textiles in Bangladesh a few weeks ago, and they were saying, you know, a lot of the manufacturers are struggling. They don't have enough water to process the fabrics anymore. And I think, again, this is where bio research can help. If you look at what Colorifix is doing, so developing microbial colors, they've done an LCA, which they've published in 22, and I think it's about 70% saving in water, 80% reduction in chemicals. It's massive. And I think this is really where we can start to really make a difference. But, you know, we need to accelerate that transition in every way we can do.
Absolutely. And, you know, although at the moment, I mean, when I think we have gone past the point now when there was a time, if you spoke about these, you know, biodesign and biomaterials, people just thought that, you know, you were some hippie and you had no idea. The one I tend to drop is if I meet somebody and they're a bit cynical, I just mention the amount of money that was dropped into Maison in the latest investment round, and then they sort of realise it's quite serious now. But it does sort of strike me there is a slightly risk here, because what we've got in sustainability as a sector is we've got plenty of entry-level talent. We've got quite a lot of mid-level talent, but we've got hardly any senior-level talent, because obviously, to attain that level of talent, you've got to have been in the industry for years, and you've got to have a high degree of technical knowledge across the sector that you're working with. And there are barely any. And so I often see, I mean, I've noticed a number of them, the big brands have been trying to fill director level, board level sustainability roles for 18 months or more, because they're struggling to find the candidates. And it strikes me that with this industry has the potential to grow, to expand hugely in the next 20 years. And there absolutely is the need for that call to action to say, right, get the funding in for the research, get the funding in for education, because we need to be training up now for these future industries, because by the time they scale, we need every strata of the operations. We need the entry level, we need the mid-management, we need the seniors to be running these companies. And that seems to be a sort of an issue at the moment, not just in terms of investment of scaling companies, but actually a recognition of how significant these industries are collectively to tackling some of the biggest issues.
But I think that will happen anyway, because legislation is changing. I mean, if you look at what the EU is doing, I know the UK has left the EU, but you know, with the new digital passport, product passport, that will radically change. So every new fashion product will have a digital page equivalent listing where the material comes from, what it's made of, is it recyclable, you know, CO2 emissions. So all of that data will be available for any of us to see, and that will drive change. So I think there's going to be a lot of quick change happening, led by legislation as well. To be fair, I think when I look at what's happening, I find that companies and industry is acting far more and far faster than governments are. I think governments are very tentative, you know, they're looking at the next 4 or 5 years. But companies, if they want, you know, particularly large brands, when they want to have longevity in their survival, they're looking at what's going to happen in 10, 20, 50 years. And they need to ensure that they will have a supply chain. So I find that particularly with large brands, they are really serious, and they're doing it far more than what governments are doing. And I think a change will happen through industry, not through politics. However, in EU, legislation is going to change, I think, and accelerate that, so that progress.
Yeah, as you say, that they're on it on the transparency, and also bringing in the right to repair as well. You know, I know France are particularly strong on this,
EU, yes,
but
yeah.
more generally the EU is yeah, absolutely. Obviously, Central St Martin's is one of the leaders in this field. Certainly, when I think to, you know, if somebody came to me and they said, you know, which courses should we think to train on, I'd send them right to you. How long do you think it will be? Obviously, at the moment, we've got a very high level of variability in terms of the teaching of sustainability, let alone biodesign, biomaterials, etc. How long do you think it will be before the education system for fashion, for apparel, for textiles really sort of catches up on these issues? What are your thoughts on that? You know, do you think we're talking a couple of years or longer?
At Central St Martin's and at UAL, we're part of University of the Arts. We have a climate and ecology action group, so I'm part of it. There's quite a few of us across all colleges, and we're leading on actions on all fronts, and we have a group leading on curriculum review, so that all fully climate and biodiversity learning and pedagogy by the next 2 years. So we have a lot of our courses already do that, and we're making sure that every single course covers that. So we're turning around quite quickly because we have to. It's not easy, it's a lot of work because that means revalidation. But this is something we're very keen to do. We're also developing new courses all the time. So we launched a new master's in regenerative design last year, which is online, and this is dedicated to practitioners around the world who can't come to London, can't come to study because they may have a job, they may have families, they may be a carer, and they want to develop a local regenerative practice. So they want to learn how to design in a way that repairs our ecosystem and our communities. And so we have a wonderful team in place for this that includes also an ecologist and an anthropologist. It's led by Judith van den Boon. So we develop new courses who are really at the cutting edge of this. I'm currently writing a new BA regenerative practice course as well. So we're now bringing that at BA level as well, and that will be a residential course. So we are fine-tuning and revisiting all our course handbooks, all our frameworks, but we're also creating very sharp new courses really to lead on that. So I think we're constantly trying to be ahead of the game.
That's brilliant. And it's fantastic that you are opening up the access to all that richness of insight, of expertise that you've got at Central St Martin's and the University of the Arts more generally to a global audience, so that wherever people are, you know, geography is not going to be that barrier to entry. And would I be right in thinking that that's going to be a flexible course for people that are working, that they can pursue part-time?
Has already started this year, and it's 3 days a week. And so people can actually have a job, can also do, it's not full 3 days. We try and do 3 hours for 3 days. But it's really, designed for people who can fit around other jobs, other responsibilities around. The BA will be at Central St Martin's though. But I think it's important for us to make sure that, you know, there's so much to do. And so we wanted to make sure that we had an online course to help with that, so that people who can't drop their job fully can still actually be part of that solution. But what is also exciting for us is that, you know, with MA Biodesign, we brought in a biologist. So there's a lecturer who is a biologist. We have 2 biologists in our Grow Lab teaching biology as well. And with the regenerative design, we've hired an ecologist. So what we're doing is we're bringing the biologists and the ecologists at the design table. Because as designers, as you know, we're not trained to really have that fundamental understanding of how ecosystems functions, operate, and how biology works, how a cell work. And we feel like we had to bring that level of expertise as part of the design curriculum. So it's fully embedded. We have amazing colleagues actually leading on this. And I think it's great to see how it changes the way we learn about design and creative practice. When you sit and have a conversation with an ecologist or a biologist, it just blows your mind, actually. And this is what, you know, I'm very jealous, actually, of our students. I want to re-enroll on a course because it's brilliant. You know, you now can have that conversation and learn from biology with the experts. And I think that's where we really are trying to change, is just to not, you know, for a long time, design was taught by designers. And I think with the climate and the biodiversity crisis, we need to bring the biodiversity experts, the ecologists, the biologists at the core of the creative curriculum. And I think that's something that Central St. Martin's is very good at, looking at other ways to provide this transformative education that will really change the way we even think about design.
When Nancy Dinez and I had our session last year, we spoke about the way in which sort of the education system is structured, and particularly in the United Kingdom, it's as opposed to in Europe where you've got the baccalaureate and you've got a sort of the capacity to study a more wide-ranging number of subjects for longer. In the UK, you have to specialise much more quickly. We were sort of just talking about sort of the idea of bringing in a sort of foundation course that actually integrates both art, design and science, if you like, a STEAM foundation. I think, you know, as someone that sort of did the traditional foundation where it was very broad and that you were studying all the different design and art disciplines, but do you know if there is a sort of a STEAM foundation yet, a sort of a course that really would just sort of lay the groundwork, and so that when those conversations with the biologists sort of happen, there is that extra sort of level of understanding, particularly those that, for example, didn't study, let's say, biology at A level, or may not have even studied at GCSE
so the MA
level.
Biodesign is a master's level, so they do a BA degree first. So there's a foundation, then there's a BA, and then there's the MA. So I don't know so much about the foundation, but I know at MA level, some of our courses do a bit of an introduction to bacterial dyeing, for instance, where and I know a lot of our BA students would be very keen to do that. One of the challenges we have is our ethos at Central St. Martin's is to learn through making, learn through doing. So on our MA, of course, they learn about biology, but it's not just theoretical lectures. They are in the grow lab, actively inoculating materials with mycelium, or observing, studying algae, whatever it is. And to really include all our BA or foundation students, we would need a gigantic biolab, which we don't have. So for now, our kind of challenge is actually a space access, because we want to make sure it's quality access for, so currently it's our BIOfutures, biodesign and art science master students who access the grow lab. But we can't open it to everybody else because there wouldn't be enough space. But where we are excited is to see that it was quite a challenge to set up a biolab in a design institution and a creative institution. But now it's there. We're just wondering why it's just the new normal. It's absolutely feel like it doesn't belong. And I think it's just very quickly became the new normal. And so I think that's really reassuring to see that, yeah, it's fine. It's just another workshop. You know, you can have your wood workshop, you can have your textile workshop, and then your biolab workshop. And I think that culture shift will hopefully start to cascade down to BA and foundation courses. But we also have students who, because we have students coming from all over the world, you know, some of them have studied biology and design before they join us on the masters. So we have a bit of everybody, a bit of everything joining.
Brilliant. And we've got time for just a couple more questions. I was going to say to anyone that is watching, if you have a question that you'd really like to ask Carole, put it in the comments section. Don't put it in the question box, put it in the comments, because then I can actually see it more easily. But Carole, I've got a couple of questions for you. So a couple more questions. So the first one is, by mid-century, what major steps would you really like to have seen in this field? How would you like to have seen society change with respect to these particular subjects?
Actually, I would like to see more capacity in terms of manufacturing these new types of fibers, materials, coloring systems, but in a way that is going beyond sustainability. So if these new materials only cut by 10% or CO2 emission compared to more conventional fiber, that's not good enough. So what I want to see for 2050 is actually carbon negative materials and biodiversity positive materials, because we need to move in that space where we are, whatever we do now, we have to go beyond the neutral impact or the low impact ambition. We need to really aim at repairing nature. And that doesn't happen by accident. That happens if that's the ethos at the starting point of the development of a project or a material. So for me, I'd like to be in 2050 in a position where, yes, we have turned around a supply chain that now has a positive impact on the natural world, has helped restore our biodiversity, and is carbon negative, not just carbon neutral.
Wonderful, wonderful. And just on scaling, one thing I've noticed in series 1, which was very much focused on the built environment, including the home, we had some very different ideas about where and how this, if you like, production was going to happen. So at the one hand, we had, yes, the sort of industrial scale, as you were speaking to, but we also had a number of ideas for the home. So we had, for example, Professor Rachel Armstrong spoke to the fact that she wants a bioreactor in every home, a small bacterial bioreactor, creating basically 12 volts of energy, but she wants to see a design revolution so that we don't have to have 240 volts. We can run a lot of things off the 12 volts. Then we had an urban fungarium, which I loved. That concept is Rachel Horton Kitchlow, and she has designed these gorgeous pieces that you can hang in your home, anywhere in your home, and they grow oyster mushrooms and other mushrooms that you can harvest. So it looks great, but it's also functional. And then we had Claudia Pesquero, who of course was speaking about her wonderful algae production systems for spirella, etc. So the home, one of the visions was for the home to become this sort of epicenter of micro production, where you're very much sort of growing your own. It's almost like the kitchen garden or the allotment has come into the house, and the whole house is functioning as an ecosystem. You're able to grow and harvest the things you need throughout your home. Can you see fashion and textiles being a part of that?
Yes,
do you sort of
completely.
see that?
It's a bit what I was referencing earlier, looking at, these new, particularly biotech, these new microbes, enzymes, yeast, and that can make new materials. For me, I would like to see them as a means to rethink the logistics of the global textile industry. Right now, a lot of you might have growing cotton in the States or in Turkey. It's all shipped to Asia. So we constantly go back and forth on the globe, which is ridiculous. But on the same, in parallel to that, we have the majority of humans now live in cities. So we are an urban species. And I think what biomaterials should offer us is the ability to grow materials local to where we live. And that could help us reorganize completely the industry. And if you think about it, it's only in the year 2000 that we mostly shifted our industry to the Far East. It's not that long ago. And it's not, for me, impossible to think that every capital cities or major cities would have their bioreactors to grow cotton-like materials, to grow cashmere-like materials, protein materials. But I wouldn't see it as an individual house-based, even in relation to built environment. I think it should be at neighborhood level or city level. Otherwise, yet again, it's in terms of ecology. If everybody has a bread maker or whatever, then you just add more electronics, more plastic, more metal to create these. Local, yes, but not necessarily individual. I think the notion of more collective, what does the bio commons look like, really, would be the question. So for me, really looking at how you know, big cities can all have their material biofactures ongoing through fermentation made from the leftover of food waste, which becomes the sugar to feed the yeast that will make the silk or the cotton. I think this is where we need to be, but not at individual scale, at neighborhood or city scale.
I love that vision. I think that's a great vision. That kind of ties in with when we had the full grown session. We were talking about what spaces, the sort of the kind of the cracks in the urban fabric that are not utilized as well as they could be, things like road verges and so forth, where there could be furniture orchards. We could be growing furniture and these kind of things, also obviously growing food as well. So I love that kind of bringing it local, but not, it's not micro, but it's still cutting down that expansive journey. We've got a question. Hannah Hansel said maybe even a bio-cottage industry.
Yeah, the question before I've seen,
so we've got,
you know, how can we make sure we don't create new problems by trying to design to repair? So that brings to adopting what I call living system thinking. So it's looking at whole system thinking. So we don't try and look at fine-tuning one tiny part of a system, but we need to understand the whole system, how it operates, and understand the consequences of our design actions on the system itself. So that living system thinking is core to biodesign. This is what we do in the Living Systems Lab, is really looking at how we can learn from living systems, but with that system thinking, so that we can actually develop better and alternative practices.
Brilliant. So I just have one more question for you, Carole. If you could have one wish, any wish at all, it can be for your own personal practice, it can be for Central St Martin's, it can be for the whole world, but it's something to do with our biofutures. What would it be?
Oh, this is going to be, I think, if I had a magic wand, it's just to make sure more people are able to engage with this easily, particularly with the young generation of designers. I meet quite a few designers who say, oh, but you know, my college or my school doesn't have a biolab. And so I think if there was a rapid cultural shift so that this becomes a formal new practice, but done in a way that is actually really looking and is driven by a quest for radical ecological solutions. So again, my big wish is that we turn around our culture to a culture of repairing the natural world.
That's beautiful. It's been a real pleasure speaking with you, Carole. My only regret is it's not in person and it's not longer. But hopefully we will be, I'm actually in France at the moment. I'm back to the UK and I'll be in London July.
That would be great.
Hopefully yes, we might be able to get together there. But thank you for your fantastic insights. I hope all is going well with the final shows coming together at St Martin's, and I'll look forward to hearing more about the really exciting work that you're doing there to help share the skills, educate the critical talent that we need to make these visions that you're speaking to come true.
Thank you so much, and
brilliant.
Good luck with all your projects.
Thank you. And just for those that are interested, tomorrow we've got Piero D'Angelo, the fashion and textile designer. He works with Biomaterials. He's going to be joining us tomorrow evening. So tune in if you'd like to. Until then, good evening and bye-bye, Carole.